Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you're having a nice weekend, and I hope you've had a chance to look over the glycolysis and gluconeogenesis, like big sheet I made for you guys. If you don't know where it is, I posted it in the PowerPoint I made on Friday. You can see like the overview of glycolysis and gluconeogenesis and the regulation for both on one page. If you need an explanation of that, I posted my former SI leader's Matt King's video about that along with it, and I'd recommend you look on that just for another explanation. So before you watch this video, I'd really recommend you go ahead and write that all by hand. Understanding the regulation for glycolysis and gluconeogenesis will make this so much easier for you. Alright, so once you've done that, we'll start with glycogen stuff. So this is a lot easier, I think, to wrap your head around. So glycogen is just the polymer of glucose. It can be branched or it can be straight chained, but a lot of it is branched. And the reason for having branched glycogen is that we can break it down easier and we can store more of it. So every single cell can store glycogen, but the liver and the muscle store the greatest amount. In the liver, glycogen store is responsible for supplying glucose to the entire organism. So that's kind of a big role right there. But in the muscle, the glycogen store is kind of selfish. It's only for that particular cell in cases when it needs energy. So the beta particle is briefly mentioned, and it's basically the elementary particle of glycogen. It's very large, with over 50,000 glucose residues, so it's pretty big, so don't let that elementary there fool you. It helps avoid large increases in osmotic pressure in liver cells. All osmotic pressure means here is it's determined by the number of particles, not the mass of particles. So if we have 50,000 individual glucose units, that will cause a gigantic increase in osmotic pressure. But if we just have one large beta particle, that will not cause a large increase of osmotic pressure. So that's the purpose of that. There we go. All right, so we talked about this a little bit before, but we're going to go over it again. The way we form a glucose polymer is just through the condensation to form a glycosidic bond. So a glycosidic bond is formed through a condensation reaction through the removal of H2O. So the hydroxyl of one glucose will react with the anomeric carbon of another and will eliminate water. And to break one of these glycosidic bonds, we would just use a hydrolysis reaction. An alpha 1,4 linkage is a straight chain with no branching, and an alpha 1,6 linkage can introduce branching. It's also important to note that we can only build or break down on the non-reducing end, not the reducing end, non-reducing end. So without further ado, we're going to get into glycogen breakdown or glycogenolysis. The whole purpose of this is to form individual glucose units from a glucose polymer. So the first step is we want to go from our glycogen polymer to glucose 1-phosphate. So as you can see, we have our big glycogen chain, and then we have, at the end of this reaction, glucose 1-phosphate and our shortened glycogen. We removed that glucose unit. However, if you notice, we didn't just remove glucose, we removed glucose 1-phosphate, so we added a phosphate group. And we do that through the enzyme called glycogen phosphorylase. So this is a phosphorylase reaction, which is important because the glycosidic linkages at the non-reducing end undergo attack by inorganic phosphate to form glucose 1-phosphate, which is a phosphate ester. This is really important for two reasons. We conserve bond energy, one, but two, if you guys remember in glycolysis, we use hexokinase to get from glucose to glucose 6-phosphate, and that requires an input of energy as ATP. We invest in ATP there. But in this case, we just added a phosphate group to glucose without the use of hexokinase, and this is going to go off to glycolysis. So what we just did is we bypassed the need for hexokinase. We got around it. We don't need to use that energy anymore. We're saving energy this way. So yeah, that's pretty cool. So glycogen phosphorylase, a lot of people think of it like Pac-Man. It will just keep breaking down alpha 1,4 linkages until it gets to a point 4 residues from an alpha 1,6 branch point. And then it's like, I don't know what to do, I can't handle branch points, oh my god. So we need another enzyme to come on in there. But before we get to the second step, I'm going to talk a little bit about regulation of glycogen phosphorylase. This is Dr. Zeile's diagram from the slides. So, glycogen phosphorylase is the enzyme I want you to think about when you think of glycogenolysis regulation. So glycogenolysis is the breakdown of glycogen, and it's actually the enzyme glycogen phosphorylase is regulated by covalent modification. When the enzyme is phosphorylated, it is active. When it is not phosphorylated, it is inactive. Phosphorylase B is its inactive form, and its phosphorylase A is the active form. So, remember, glucagon typically activates kinases and insulin activates a phosphatase. And glucagon, we got to think of glucose is gone. Low glucose levels, insulin, we think high glucose. And another important thing is just like serine side chains are what we're using to phosphorylate and dephosphorylate. So we need glycogenolysis in situations of low blood glucose, or if we have a high demand for energy. So think glucagon, think epinephrine. Another important thing to note is the muscles do not have glucagon receptors. They have to rely on epinephrine. That's like fight or flight, that's adrenaline. Also, in the muscle, high concentrations of calcium show muscle contractions, and a lot of muscle contractions signal that we need energy, so they can also activate phosphorylase B kinase. So the liver will release glucagon during low blood glucose, or the muscle will release epinephrine if we need energy. And they'll activate CAMP, which will activate pKa, which has many different targets, one of which is phosphorylase B kinase. It will become activated, and it will phosphorylate this enzyme into its active form, phosphorylase A. So now we can go through glycogen breakdown. But we don't need to do glycogenolysis if we already have high blood glucose. Why would we want to break down our glycogen store if we already have high blood glucose? So insulin will then be there and will activate receptor tyrosine kinase, which will activate PP1, which will remove the phosphate group from glycogen phosphorylase and make it its inactive form, phosphorylase B. And then we won't go through glycogen breakdown because we have high blood glucose and we have no need to. So the second enzyme is named the debranching enzyme, and I think you can figure out its purpose from that. So this is glycogen breakdown near an alpha-1,6 branch point. Our glycogen phosphorylase is awesome, but it can't handle branch points. So it has two different functions. It has a transferase function and a glycosidic activity. The transferase activity will transfer a block of 3 glucose residues from a branch to a nearby non-reducing end. And then the glycosidic activity will take off glucose. So it's important to note here that our glycogen phosphorylase is particularly cool because it adds a phosphate group onto it, so we don't have to use hexokinase. But unfortunately, the debranching enzyme cannot do this. It has alpha-1,6 glycosidic activity that will remove just glucose, not glucose 1-phosphate, so glucose from the debranching enzyme will need to be phosphorylated by hexokinase as well. So our third step is phosphoglucomutase. In this case, we have our glucose 1-phosphate, but we still need to convert it back to glucose 6-phosphate so it can undergo the rest of glycolysis. That's okay because we already added our phosphate group. All we got to do is move it around through the use of a mutase. This is where knowing like your different enzyme functions comes into help. Like if you know what a mutase is, if you know what a phosphatase is, if you know what a kinase is, a dehydrogenase, that really helps you kind of figure out what these do without thinking too far into it on an exam. So yeah, this can be used in glycolysis. Our last step is a phosphatase, glucose 6-phosphatase. So you might be wondering, we just added a phosphate group, why would we need to remove it? So in the liver and the kidney, I told you before, the glycogen store is responsible for supplying glucose to the entire body. So in order to do that, we have to get out of the cell. The whole point of phosphorylating glucose to glucose 6-phosphate is to keep it stuck in the cell because we have transporters for glucose, but not for glucose 6-phosphate or glucose 1-phosphate. So we have to dephosphorylate it in order to get that glucose out of the cell to where it needs to go. So that's why we'll use glucose 6-phosphate and we'll get back to just glucose. It's actually in the ER. It resides in the lumen, actually, and all other enzymes are in the cytosol, and then GLUT2 will allow glucose to leave the cell. So scrolling down, this is what I did for glycogenolysis. I wrote everything down. Actually, what I did was I cut the page in half. I wrote glycogenolysis on one side, glycogenesis on the other side, so I could see the breakdown and the synthesis of glycogen on one sheet of paper. So what I'd recommend is you actually pause this right now and you copy this down in your own handwriting. So go ahead and do that. Scroll down a little. Awesome. Okay, so we're going to go through glycogenesis now. Glycogenesis is the synthesis of glycogen. We just did the breakdown, now we're going to do the synthesis. So a lot of the regulation is like exact opposites because they're needed in exact opposite circumstances. So this is an anabolic pathway that requires energy. So the first step is the formation of an activated sugar nucleotide. And we do this through an enzyme called UDP, glucose pyrophosphorylase. Kind of a mouthful. So we have glucose 1-phosphate and UDP, that's our nucleotide, and we go to UDP glucose. So we have an activated sugar nucleotide by the end of it. So the anomeric carbon basically is just activated by the attachment to the nucleotide UDP through the phosphate ester linkage. So we do this because UDP is necessary as a substrate for our next step, because this process takes energy. So just so you know that this is like actually crucial that we have our UDP glucose. So make sure you understand that UDP glucose is necessary to go through glycogenesis. And this is actually like a nucleotide, which is pretty cool. So their second step is when we want to elongate our glycogen chains, and we do this through glycogen synthase. So the substrate, as I said before, is UDP glucose, and chain elongation results in the transfer of a glucose unit from UDP glucose to the non-reducing end of the glycogen branch. So as I said before, you can only add or take away from the non-reducing end. So this will make a new alpha-1,4 linkage and will come with the elimination of UDP. So we just added this just to take it away. The whole point of adding it was so we could add a glucose unit to the end of the glycogen branch. So this is how we synthesize linear chains of glucose, and this is the enzyme I want you to think about when you think of regulation of glycogenesis, glycogen synthase. So this is again Dr. Zeile's beautiful picture, much neater than my picture. So in its active form, it's not phosphorylated. It's called glycogen synthase A, and it's not phosphorylated. In its inactive form, it's called glycogen synthase B, and it is phosphorylated. So in situations of high blood glucose, think insulin, think glucose 6-phosphate. We already went through the first step of glycolysis. Think glucose. We have a lot of glucose going on. We do want to build up glycogen. We can afford it. We want to have that. We want to have that glycogen stored for when we need it one day. So what will happen is insulin will activate a receptor tyrosine kinase, which will activate PP1, which will remove the phosphate group, making glycogen synthase into its active form when it's dephosphorylated. If you think about it, it makes sense that it's dephosphorylated in its active form, because once you realize that insulin activates a phosphatase, insulin is there in conditions of high blood glucose. Phosphatases remove phosphoryl groups. We want to undergo glycogen synthesis when we have a lot of glucose. So glycogen synthase is active when it's dephosphorylated because insulin's been there. On the flip side, if we have low blood glucose, we do not want to build up glycogen. So glucagon or epinephrine will activate pKa, which will phosphorylate our glycogen synthase, which will turn it into its inactive form, glycogen synthase B. If we have low blood glucose, we have no reason to build up glycogen. We need to be using the available glucose to get the energy we need to survive. So we wouldn't want to build up our glycogen stores in this case. A lot of times Dr. Zeile will say, does this make sense? Why does this make sense? That's how you need to think about regulation. It makes complete sense that it works this way. You just kind of have to think through it a little bit and kind of put these connections together in your head, and you'll get it. I believe in you. So we just did step 2, and now we're on to step 3. This is the branch synthesis step, and our friend the branching enzyme is back. So again, a beautifully named enzyme. We just built our linear glycogen chains, and now we want to add some branches. Again, our linear one just couldn't handle it. We need a different enzyme called the branching enzyme to do this. So we basically, it's an amylo 1,4 to 1,6 trans, I can't even say that, I'm sorry. But what we're doing is we're basically making new branches. It catalyzes the addition of a branch at the 6-hydroxyl every 7 residues. So we'll cleave off 7 residues of linear chain and position them to make an alpha 1,6 linkage. So all it's doing is kind of moving things around to create a new branch. So I again wrote it all out like this, a little messy, I'm sorry. And I'd recommend you do the same. So go ahead and pause this, write this out for yourself. With that being said, I'm going to go on to regulation. So these are some great pictures from Dr. Zeile. I really like these pictures. I just want you guys to note that I wrote all this out in my own handwriting, but I think it's important for you guys to do it as well without just seeing mine. Because just writing this out in straight up words and not diagrams, I think helps clarify all these processes in your head. So In conditions of low blood glucose, we have our glucagon activated. We should know that glucagon will increase the amount of CAMP, which will activate pKa, which has a ton of targets. It will activate phosphorylase kinase, which will activate glycogen phosphorylase, which will increase the amounts of glycogen breakdown. That makes sense. If we have low blood glucose, we want to break down our glycogen stores. The whole point of having a glycogen store is so we can break it down when we don't have a lot of glucose, and we can use that to get energy. So that makes sense. If we have if we have low blood glucose, increased glucagon, increased CAMP, increased pKa, will decrease the amount of glycogen synthase that occurs, because we don't want to waste the glucose we have building up glycogen when we already have low blood glucose. So then we'll have decreased glycogen synthesis. In addition, this goes back to glycolysis and gluconeogenesis. If we have low blood glucose, high glucagon, high CAMP, high pKa, basically what's going to happen is we're going to basically get to decreased glycolysis, because we're going to want to build up and go through gluconeogenesis if we have low blood glucose. So this will lead to an increase FB-PACE2 activity and a decrease in PFK2 activity. If you guys remember the bifunctional enzyme, there it is again, which will lead to a decrease in fructose 2,6-bisphosphate, which will lead to inactive PFK1, which will lead to less glycolysis. On the flip side, it will lead to an increase in gluconeogenesis. So if we do high blood glucose, it's kind of the same thing. We'll have, but opposite, obviously. We'll have high amounts of insulin, which will activate a phosphatase. This phosphatase will lead to an increase in glycogen synthase, which will lead to an increase in glycogen synthesis. If we have high blood glucose, we can afford to build up our glycogen store. Also, it will lead to a decrease in phosphorylase kinase, which will lead to a decrease in glycogen phosphorylase activity, which will lead to a decrease in glycogen breakdown, because we don't want to be breaking down glycogen when we already have high blood glucose. We don't need to. In addition, a lot of insulin will lead to activation of hexokinase, PFK1, pyruvate kinase, all of those glycolysis enzymes, which will lead to an increase in glycolysis. If we have high blood glucose, we can basically lead to, we can afford to go through glycolysis in our liver. We will decrease the amount of gluconeogenesis in our liver. Yeah. Okay, so scrolling down. The muscle is a little bit different. It's kind of a little bit confusing, actually. You need to keep this straight in your head, because the muscle, first of all, it has no way to do gluconeogenesis. That only occurs in the liver. And they also have no glucagon receptor, but they do have an insulin receptor. So instead of that glucagon receptor, they have an epinephrine receptor. The epinephrine receptor does the same thing as the glucagon receptor, basically, in terms of its effects, but they just don't have a glucagon receptor, so it's kind of weird. The liver also has an epinephrine receptor. So epinephrine in the muscle will signal the breakdown of glycogen into glucose 6P, so there'll be an increase in glycolysis, and then because they have an insulin receptor, insulin will increase the amount of glycogen synthesis. All right, so we're going to do a few questions, a few regulation questions. So much fun. So this one says, you wake up late on the morning of your first 5K and you have to skip breakfast to make it to the race on time. Upon finishing the race, you are starving and go home with your roommates to eat lunch. For lunch, you have pizza, cookies, soda, and chips. After you eat lunch, what is the metabolic state of your liver and leg muscles? They threw a lot at you in these questions, and this is very similar to Zeile's questions. You have to sit there and be like, okay, what is the state of my body? Get around all of the story and just get to what's going on. So this is kind of weird because they bring up a 5K, so you're thinking, okay, we're exercising, and you're starving, and you skipped breakfast with low blood glucose, but then you went home and you ate a gigantic lunch and you're just sitting there. So kind of a lot, but basically we're in a condition of high blood glucose, despite all this stuff at the beginning that was just there to confuse you. If we're in a condition of high blood glucose, the answer is actually going to be 3. So high blood glucose will promote the synthesis of glycogen in both the liver and the muscles. First of all, you can't do gluconeogenesis in the leg muscles, so we'd want to be synthesizing glycogen if we have high blood glucose. We wouldn't need to go through gluconeogenesis if we have high blood glucose, so yeah. All right, the next, I might just give away the answer. It's fine. If gluconeogenesis is occurring in the liver, which metabolic pathway can be occurring in the muscle? So the answer is 2 of the above are correct, and the reason for that is we cannot undergo gluconeogenesis in our muscles. That's important to keep straight in your head. Yeah. We're likely going to be breaking down our glycogen store, and we always are undergoing glycolysis in the muscle. We have to, we need it. So, after eating 3 pizzas, glycogen synthase in your liver will be what? So, the way I want you to think about this is glycogen synthase, what does it do? What does it activate? Glycogen synthase is part of glycogenesis. We are increasing our glycogen store. We're building up our glycogen store. So, this occurs in situations of high blood glucose. In situations of high blood glucose, insulin is activated. Insulin activates phosphatases, which dephosphorylate things. So, there we go. So eating 3 pizzas will cause a large increase in blood sugar. So insulin will activate PP1, which will dephosphorylate glycogen synthase, which will activate it to store excess sugar. So the answer is D here. I like this question. Oh, I keep giving away the answer. I'm sorry. You are trapped on an island for 3 weeks and have nothing to eat. The blank activity of the bifunctional enzyme will become activated in glycolysis will what? Okay, so I guess I'll just explain this with the answer. I'm sorry. So if you're trapped on an island for 3 weeks and you have nothing to eat, you have low blood glucose. If you have low blood glucose, just think about like why would we go through glycolysis? We need to basically go through gluconeogenesis. We need to build up glucose. We don't have enough of it. So we know that this one will decrease. And we also know that when FBPase2 is active, the bifunctional enzyme will actually make less F2,6 bisphosphate, which will inhibit PFK1 and decrease glycolysis while increasing gluconeogenesis. So the answer for this one is C. So let me just go over that again because I said that kind of mumble-jumbled. FBPase2 will decrease levels of fructose 2,6-bisphosphate, which will inhibit PFK1 and decrease glycolysis in situations of low blood glucose. Think glucagon. All right, so those are just a few examples, just kind of getting your head around thinking about these things, and once you understand these pathways, I think that'll help a lot. All right, so that's all I've got for you guys today. Yeah, message me if you have any questions.